Yes, in Dungeons and Dragons terms, I'm true neutral. Not neutral good, not neutral evil. True neutral. Welcome to this episode of the Comical Heathen. This is your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe. Welcome to today's episode. It features my interview with Brian Malow, the science comedian. We're going to get into what is a science comedian. All right? Why are we going to get into what, in fact, is a science comedian? Because I, your host, Dr. Jerry Jaffe, am, in fact, writing a book. You're probably sitting there thinking to yourself, writing a book? Why, Jerry, what book are you writing? Well, I've been working on this book for a few years. It's one of these things I'd like to get done someday. And it's a book about religious satire. And I thought it would be interesting to interview some comedians and some writers and some other interesting people for the book. And then, hey, I turned those interviews into recordings and those recordings into this podcast. So I thought some of you might be interested in talking about religious satire, comedy, religion, and, all of the above. Let's see what we got going today. Before I get to my interview, cover some housekeeping stuff. Listeners of the show, and I know there's 2 or 3 of you, listeners of the show know that this show has a mascot. Me and my wife keep 2 Holland Lop rabbits, Kelvin and Newton, and I always like to give little updates from the rabbit hutch. Here's something that I noticed about keeping rabbits. If you ever saw Bambi, there's a character in there. It's a rabbit called Thumper, and that's one of those things that turns out to be a real thing. Rabbits do thump their feet to communicate with each other. Rabbits can't vocalize. They're not like cats or dogs or great apes or whiny Republicans. They can't vocalize, so they have to communicate other ways. And one of the ways they communicate is by thumping their foot. It lets other rabbits know their location, if there's danger, that they need attention, even kind of like saying hello. Although often it means stay away. I had kind of a funny thing happen. Our rabbits are called Newton and Kelvin. One is Kelvin. He's a broken black rabbit. That's a type of coloration, black and white, like an Oreo cookie. He likes to get under the furniture, which you don't want your rabbits under the furniture. It's kind of dangerous. There's nails, there's staples, there's webbing, there's all kinds of stuff under there. So we like to block off our furniture, but he's persistent. Rabbits are persistent. They're smarter than you think, and they can get in there. So every once in a while, if you turn your head or don't pay attention, he'll end up under a piece of furniture. So what's happened recently is I'll walk into the room where he's supposed to be, and I don't see him, and so I'll make a thumping noise. I'll clap my hands and say his name like this. Kelvin. Kelvin. And sure as shooting, when I do that, he thumps back. They'll thump. And then he's under the chair. I'll do it again. Clap my hands. Kelvin. Little thump. He is under the chairs. Here's the cute part. I'll clap my hands and say, Kelvin, go to your room. And that means go into your cage. And we keep his cage open during the day, so he can hop around. And he knows that go to your room means go to your cage. So, Kelvin, go to your room. And then he'll thump. But he won't come out right away. I got to do it 2 or 3 times. Kelvin, go to your room. Thump. Kelvin, go to your room. Thump. And then he crawls out from under the chair and runs over to his cage. So, look at that. I am the bunny whisperer. I can talk to rabbits, apparently, by thumping my hands. All right. Another thing about keeping rabbits is that you have to line their cage. And, me and my wife use newspapers sometimes for that. And that has caused this weird side effect of me reading newspapers again, like actual paper newspapers in this internet age. I bet you didn't even know they still make newspapers, ripping up the papers or putting them into the cage. And you notice the headlines. That's what you do. You scan the headlines. And every once in a while, at the bottom of the rabbit hutch, I will come across a headline that is on some topic related to religion or pseudoscience that sort of, gets my dander up. And that's what just happened this week. I saw at the bottom of the rabbit cage an article. This was from an edition of the Independent UK. This is from April 2019, and the headline actually said, Polish priests burn Harry Potter in protest against witchcraft, byline to Tom Barnes. Yeah, that's right. Polish priests are burning Harry Potter books and some other pop culture items on this big religious bonfire. Their stated reason for this bonfire and for burning the Harry Potter books is that magic is sacrilege. So first off, sure, go for it. Try to nip this Harry Potter thing in the bud before it gets out of hand. Although, kind of like, too late. Harry Potter's already the #1 selling book in the English language, Catholic priests. I think you should have done this a little while ago if you're actually trying to accomplish something. But I find burning Harry Potter books because they have magic in them odd. Because the only magic in Harry Potter is J.K. Rowling's enchanting story of a scrappy orphan. Oh, J.K. Rowling, how did you make me fall in love? But as far as actual, like, necromancer, supernatural powers, there is no magic in Harry Potter. It's fiction. It's a collection of made-up stories about fictional characters who use magic. And it seems like these priests are spending a lot of effort getting worked up about a collection of made-up stories about fictional characters with supernatural powers. Now, why does that sound so familiar? Bible. Bible. Yeah, maybe they don't like the competition, right? The article says that people were praying to end magic, which that doesn't seem fair, because I've never heard of magicians casting a spell to try to end praying. And anyway, if prayers really worked, couldn't these Catholic priests just stay home and pray? Why do they need to be on site at a book burning to pray? In case God can't see them or he can't hear them? You can light a big bonfire, throw a few books in it. Hey, God, over here. I'm sure he'll find us. I gave him solid directions at the highway. Oh, but just in case, I've asked the good people at Bloomsbury Publishing to provide us with these signal flares. Kindling. I mean, why, if prayer works, why do they need to burn any books or have a book burning? It's like abortion protesters that have signs that say, pray to end abortion. If they really believed prayer would work to end abortion, then why are they standing outside clinics harassing people? Can't they just stay home and pray, eat, love, watch Springer, instead of burning the book, Eat, Pray, Love? You know, the reason priests are opposed to magic is because Leviticus warns that witches should be stoned. And just to be clear, not the good stoned, the actual, like Leviticus, death by rock stoning. And not death by the good rock, like death by AC/DC, for those about to rock, we salute you, but more of a, for those about to read Harry Potter, we will kill you with rocks and pebbles. Well, you know, maybe not like pebbles, more of a bam bam. Ha! Bet you didn't see that one coming. This sounds like an ad for a head shop. Come down to Leviticus when you're ready to get stoned, and I mean really stoned. You know, immediately following this performance of Harry Potter and the pointless photo op, the priest could then hold the sacrament of the Eucharist. Here, eat this magical cracker as it magically becomes the body of our Lord, and then drink this supernatural grape juice, which through supernatural powers becomes his blood. And God has magically granted me the supernatural powers to make this epic, supernatural, magical event possible. Hey, good thing there wasn't any magic involved. As a quick side note, does that ceremony remind anyone else of that old children's Halloween game, The Witch's Hair? You know, that's like a Halloween party for little kids, and you blindfold the kid, and you have them touch food like spaghetti, and you call it The Witch's Hair. I mean, you know, doesn't it remind ooh, touch this cracker, it's the body of Christ, and this grape juice is the blood of Christ. Oh, don't open your eyes, kids. This beef jerky is Jesus' skin after being out in the hot sun all day without any suntan lotion. Ooh, and this jello is Jesus' brain. Father, what's this banana and 2 plums? Oh, keep your eyes closed, Billy, keep your eyes closed. You don't want to ruin the surprise. Oh, that took a dark turn at the end. Did you know that Poland also has the world's largest statue of Jesus? Because the Bible strictly forbids magic, but the commandment against graven images can go fuck itself. And why are people in Poland so obsessed with God seeing them? Hey, God, over here, I got a big bonfire and this giant statue. Man, that deity needs some glasses. In Harry Potter, the evil Death Eaters follow a narcissistic and genocidal maniac good wizards call he who must not be named, or as we call him in America, 45. You know, besides Harry Potter books, there were other pop culture things in this bonfire. They were burning Twilight books, which I kind of get. They were burning pink umbrellas, which I kind of don't get. And then after the bonfire, they were going to have an exorcism of a Roomba. The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you. Oh, and these batteries. Look, Catholic priests, I guess the book burning approach was deemed less labor intensive than the original plan of handwriting in, "It turns out it was God's love all along" on the last page of every copy. Look, Polish priests, there has never, ever, even once, ever been a book burning that was on the right side of history. Not once. Check yourself. Think about it for a second. If you're standing at a book burning, you are de facto already wrong. I'm not counting high school math books in that, but I'm just talking about, like, book burnings, But listen, if you insist on burning books, could you at least buy like 10,000 copies of my books and burn those? I'm just saying, I got a lot of student loans, and I could use the cash. And that's what I found at the bottom of the rabbit hutch today. And, when I see misinformation, I consider it a sin. And I'm sorry if it's your dogma, but it's my karma. So I gotta say something. What I gotta say now is the lead into my interview. If you're sticking around this far into this podcast, you're probably here to hear Brian Malow, the science comedian. It's a little bit interesting to me, if you're paying attention. My last two podcast episodes, one was with author A.J. Jacobs, who wrote the book Year of Living Biblically, which we talk about in that. But he does talk about how that book was, at least in part, like a post-September 11th concept, like a pushback against religious fundamentalism. And also, the episode before that was Ian Harris, the skeptic comedian. And he also was like about using rationality to push back against pseudoscience and religious extremism. And I mentioned that context a little bit because although Brian Malow is very, very pro-science, one of the things that comes up in this interview is that he's not like specifically talking about or even bullish about religion or religious satire. He just loves science. So I asked him about that. And I mean, if you know Brian Malow, a couple of things to let you know. He does do, in addition to doing stand-up comedy, he does do communication seminars at science conferences for researchers. He has written for the Neil deGrasse Tyson StarTalk podcast. He's friends with Mr. Tyson. Talk about that a little bit. We do talk about creationism and other sort of anti-science movements. And because I'm interested in comedy after September 11th, we talk about that a little bit. So, please listen. I hope you enjoy it. I do want to give you one other thing. I have to give a couple of shout-outs here. Couple of thank yous. First of all, I want to thank the people at the coffee shop Starfish and Coffee in Paynesville, Ohio. That's where Brian and I had this conversation. It's like hip local coffee shops, really good coffee, and the owners love Prince. So I don't know if you caught that, but Starfish and Coffee is actually a reference to Prince. They let us do the interview there. They actually turned off the background music, which I really appreciate, and I promised them I'd give their shop a shout-out, so Starfish and Coffee. It's still, though, a coffee shop, so there are some background noises. A couple times they grind beans. You hear some other voices. All in all, it's not too distracting. I probably shouldn't even be mentioning it. I do want to mention, too, the reason I was able to spend some time with Brian is that he came to the college where I teach, which is Lake Erie College near Cleveland, and he did some seminars during the day and a comedy show at night, and he was a big hit on campus, really loved him. And but to bring him to campus, we got some funding from something called the Royce Fund. So I just want to thank the Royce Fund for, making Brian's visit to campus possible. Now, with that in mind, hey, here's my interview with Brian Malow.
Or the artist formerly known as.
Yes, the painting formerly known as. Mm-hmm. It's a Prince-inspired motif for this coffee shop. The voice you're hearing is science comedian Brian Malow.
Yes.
The reason for the awkward pause is because I have to remind myself that his last name rhymes with shallow. So should you find yourself at home trying to remember Brian's last name?
If there were two L's, everyone would get it right. But there's only one L.
Has this curse followed you your entire life?
It has. Brian gets misspelled brain, and Mallow gets mangled to the extent of often Marlowe. It's like, well, they inserted an R in there.
Sure.
Because they didn't know what to do with it. Mallow.
Merlot?
Yeah,
Merlot only goes with certain meals, so that's...
And I go for all meals.
Yeah. Brian is here with me because, thankfully, I have to make a shout-out thanks to the Royce Fund for the Performing Arts at Lake Erie College, which has made his visit to Paynesville and Lake Erie College
Yeah, that
possible.
check is still in your pocket, not mine, right?
Correct. Well,
you know that it's...
That's why you're doing this interview right now.
Exactly. You know that if the check were in my pocket, I would have no impetus to be funny later. I still have to give a science communication talk and then a comedy show. And yeah, it's always a little risky to pay the comedian before the show.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Because then it's like, well, I've already been paid.
Yes, definitely.
You're not as hungry for it.
How long have you, that sounds like some real wisdom. How
Oh,
long,
yes. I have so much wisdom like that.
How long have you been comedyifying?
Oh, too long. I was in graduate school in Austin, Texas,
Right.
when I first did the Funniest Person in Austin contest.
And were you the funniest person in Austin?
And no, not by a long shot. But in the first night of prelims, I was one of the 3 funniest people that night.
All right, well done.
And I advanced and that was my 3rd time on stage.
Okay.
So it was surprising. And, it's funny because I do look at that with this new perspective, which is I understand that when there's a Funniest Person in Austin contest, later I was part of the comedy scene there. And so most of the people in the contest. But then there's always a couple people that just signed up because funniest person in Austin. Yeah. I'm funny. I should try that.
My friends say I'm funny.
Well, so I was this total unknown.
Right.
I had shown up for 2 open mics.
Right.
Maybe 1 or 2 people saw me, but there was nothing much to see. But I came in with a very well-prepared routine my 3rd time for the contest. And I know now what it must have been like to the comics going like, well, where did he come from? Because he's not on the scene.
Right.
And I rocked that night. And then a couple weeks later in the finals, I tried to repeat the magic. I thought I was so good because I rocked my 3rd time. But my 4th time, I learned an important lesson. You can say all the same words.
Right.
And think you're saying and bomb and turn around like, wow. I said the same word
in the same order.
In the same order.
Wow.
But something crucially, just the fact is, I wasn't funny that night.
Right.
I didn't deliver it well. I was trying to repeat the magic, and my acting chops weren't there. Or whatever it took, whatever it was. That 3rd time, I was radiating that I was funny, and the 4th time I was not.
So was this the 80s, the 90s?
Yeah, late 80s, like right before,
So the theme of this podcast is religious satire in support of a book I'm writing on the subject. But before we get into those kinds of themes, I want to know a little bit more about you, give the audience a chance to know a little bit more about you.
Do I want the audience to know about me?
Is there
That's
an audience?
Is there an audience? Okay, there you go.
Let's not get too
Do I
pretentious
want
here.
this recorder to know that much about me?
Do I want the other 3 people in this coffee shop to know that much about it?
Do I want there to be a digital file that encodes
the
this
live
information?
audience is actually bigger than the at-home listening to this podcast audiences.
Yeah, that's sad because I can see them all in one
I'm expecting
glance.
to get the Brian Malow bump, so make sure you share this with all of your friends. Yeah. What was comedy like in the 80s in Texas? Like, what was that scene like?
It's pretty good. Like, so, we've touched on this already. I started in Austin. Right. Austin is a cool city. Like, cool people in Texas tend to gravitate. And people that are weird and artistic tend to gravitate towards Austin, But there were also some Austin comics that were former Houston comics. The Houston Comedy Workshop had spawned Sam Kinison and Bill Hicks.
Yes.
And a few other interesting people. And some of those people ended up being Austin comics. Like some of those they were what called they had a little group called the Outlaw Comics.
Sure.
I mean, I saw Hicks perform and I met him a few times.
Okay.
I had one really unique experience because I was with this guy, Riley Barber, an old Houston comic. We dropped by Kevin Booth's house. So Kevin, he worked with Hicks on Hicks's music. Sure. They recorded music and also on video productions. Okay. So Sane Man, and there was like Ninja Bachelor Party, I think, was this funny video they made that was, shot on VHS, probably low. Anyway, one time Riley Barber and I, we dropped by Kevin Booth's house where him and Bill Hicks were recording music. Okay. And we sat in for a while until I felt like we should leave because they don't want an audience. They're doing a creative project.
So in the year 2019,
that's now.
Your brand is the science comedian.
Yeah.
So how did you end up with that persona?
It wasn't calculated. It was a very natural evolution. When I eventually came up with that phrase, science comedian, and checked, and sciencecomedian.com was available.
Right.
I thought that's either a really good sign or a really bad sign. Maybe it's useless real estate. When I told an old friend of mine, he was like, we knew you were the science comedian 10 years ago. So the thing is, I liked science first. Sure. Science fiction, and then science, so when I became a comedian...
In the 80s and 90s, were you doing science or science fiction type jokes?
Yeah, but I'll say yes in that there was a flavor there of my sense of humor. It's like if I wrote something that had a punchline that used some science language or a metaphor from science. I would I would say that my mom would lose weight, my dad would gain weight, And when my dad lost weight, my mom gained weight. It was like the conservation of mass within our family. It was funny to me to look at things through kind of a science worldview or to apply absurdly. You know, I wasn't trying to teach necessarily or anything, but just like this, absurdly, like this is the language and the voice that I like to write in from the beginning, but not exclusively.
Yeah.
And then some jokes, this is what I did in nightclubs, very slightly geeky stuff.
Right.
But there were some jokes that were like too geeky.
Sure.
And you would do them, and they don't really work very well in a nightclub.
Right.
And so you stop doing them. But then you get the right audience. Like I did had a gig for a bunch of engineers at Apple.
Right.
And I pulled out every geeky joke and it killed. And I realized I have to find that audience.
Yes.
I was like getting some shows like that and collaborating with, there was a woman in the Bay Area that did funny science songs, and she sometimes put on a cabaret and I'd be a comedian there.
Sure.
And it was this audience that wanted that. And then but the big thing was coming up with the phrase science comedian, which really literally I had never heard that phrase before. I don't know. It popped into my head. I looked for it, found it, and now I use it everywhere.
When you looked for it and found it, about how long ago was that?
I think about 11 years ago.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
Apparently no one else had looked for it and found it. So then, whatever, each new thing that came along on YouTube, Science Comedian, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. So
what does it mean to be or the science comedian?
Yeah, well, here's what it doesn't mean. One time a woman asked me, "Oh, so you teach kids about science using stand-up comedy?" And I was like, "No, if you're a geek, I'll make you laugh." Very different. But the thing is, there is something of the teacher in
Hold
me.
on a second. I just laughed. That may mean I'm a geek. You made me laugh.
Probably
Are.
Okay. I feel like I can make non-geeks laugh too.
Okay.
But that might just be a feeling I have.
Not to be confused with the scientific method.
Yes.
You work clean, like if you're in a bar and there's bikers staring at you, and you throw the F word into a joke about your wife or whatever, like you can spice it up.
Yeah.
But if you're like a real dirty comic, you can't unspice it. Like that's
Sometimes
just your
you
joke.
can, yeah.
So can you spice up your science comedy?
There's been a couple routines that are more appropriate for a nightclub audience, but they're geeky. This isn't entirely true. I'm gonna say that maybe I don't have to spice it up.
Sure. Yeah,
maybe I can just be funny with this material and make, or whatever material. Because I still have some stuff that's not as geeky as other stuff, and some stuff that's not sciencey at all. But you know what? I think before I came up with Science Comedian, I had used a title for a show, Rational Comedy for an Irrational Planet.
Sure.
So you can hear that it's like, I was always dancing around like some sciencey stuff. I had promo material that said, I'm not Science Comedian yet, but it would say, he has more science jokes than the average comedian. And there was a brain, because Brian gets misspelled brain a lot. And so I toyed with that kind of stuff. And I did some gigs for like Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and South Dakota School of Mines and Technology and Mines. So I knew that I was there. I just didn't have that. It didn't crystallize as something that you can go, oh, science comedian. That explains it in 2 words.
But what is it?
It's like
what are you, science comedian?
Well, what do you mean? I'm just a comedian. Like, you don't ask a political comedian what he is. It's like, I'm a comedian and my stuff is a little science geeky. And sometimes you could learn a little something, but a lot of times it's just silliness. And, I'd like to think that if someone comes to a show and they weren't even expecting science comedy, they just came to the club. Right. That if all I did is not teach them anything, but I made them laugh for an hour.
Sure.
With material that if they thought science was boring or science was hard or something, and I just made you laugh for an hour with pretty geeky material. Sure. And maybe you didn't get every single reference, but for the most part, all the jokes are, my girlfriend's shorter than me. The first time I saw her, I thought she was farther away than she actually was. Yes. Anyone's going to get that. It almost always works. Right. There's this thing where sometimes people, it sounds cocky to say that you're funny or a joke is funny, but it really isn't, because after a while you go, like, that joke, I've told it 1,000 times.
For a comedian, that's more of a clinical statement. It is almost a scientific statement.
This joke has proven, there's nothing
in the laboratory.
It doesn't mean it's going to work every time.
Yes.
But there's nothing you can say to me. You can't convince me that joke isn't funny, because I've seen it work 1,000 times. Yes. So I could screw it up. There could be bad timing. Yeah. There could be a million. That audience may not laugh at it, but it's funny because it's proven itself. And so there's this weird and there's this other part to it too. It's like, where do these jokes come from? they pop into your head, and oftentimes I'm the first audience for a joke. It's like, it made me laugh.
Right.
So I think it's funny because it made me laugh, and then I tell it, and you laughed. So it's like, okay, maybe it's funny.
You did a show in an earlier incarnation called Rational Irrational? Or
Rational comedy for an irrational thing. So that's just to say that I already knew that I was working this thing that was rational.
Yes.
Okay, so I didn't have this phrase science comedian, but a lot of my jokes are very rational. So it's like I think that my sense of humor has always been very rational. Okay. And I feel like my sensibilities are more formed by Isaac Asimov. I did have early comedy influences. In my house, we had George Carlin albums. It surprises me a little that my parents, at a young age, I had Richard Pryor albums. George Carlin. I had Monty Python albums. And I would say George Carlin was clearly a big influence. Steve Martin albums too. Of course. But I grew up on Isaac Asimov and his science fiction and his science writing. And he wrote with personality, and he wrote with humor sometimes, and he was very rational.
And what are the 3 laws of robotic comedians?
We can come up with something.
Yeah, we'll come up.
Let's call that a rhetorical question.
Yes, a rhetorical question.
But Asimov, is a good segue into other stuff because he's also famous rational atheist scientist.
Well, so you're the
writer.
science comedian. There's our mutual acquaintance Ian Harris, the skeptic comedian.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about the sub genre of comedians that are intentionally aligning themselves
with science,
with science and rationality, critical thinking skills.
Surely there's some more.
So let's assume there are. What's up with that? Why is there a subgenre movement of comedians that are aligning themselves with science or critical thinking skills?
No, it seems pretty natural, though. I mean, of all the science geeks, some of them are going to be funny, and all the atheists, some are going to be funny. I do see some connections. I've talked to some Nobel laureates in science about this as well, that I see some interesting connections between science and comedy.
Okay.
A lot of it is about pattern seeking.
Sure.
And recognizing patterns. That, first of all, researchers, like comedians, you don't want to do material that's already been done. Science, you have to do your scholarship must be new material.
Yes.
If it's already been done, you're not going to be able to publish.
Right.
You need originality, and you need to see something that no one else has seen before. A lot of times, discoveries aren't about new information, but it's about looking at the information in a different way, like a new paradigm.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's about seeing a pattern that no one else saw. Hey, this is connected to this.
Right.
Comedy is very much like that. It's like comedians show it to you in a way that you haven't thought. And then you've seen so many laughs are out of recognition where you're like, oh my God, I know.
Yes.
But it took that comedian to point it out or to draw these connections.
Right.
And some are more subtle than others. So there's a little of that. One other thing that's on the other end of things is that so many people have their eye on retirement. It's like, when I reach this age or this many years with the company or the state, I can retire. Scientists and artists and comedians and musicians don't tend to look at things that way because they're doing what they love. And as I said to one scientist, if you retire, you'll have more time to do your research. Right. Which is what he loves to do. Yes. And same with comedians. It's like, well, first of all, maybe a lot of comedians don't have health care benefits and they never, unless they strike it big at some point, retirement may not even be an option. But it's not like they're looking to retire. Yeah, I mean, there might be a day when nobody wants to see your old
Yeah, what's your retirement plan is to die on a stage in the Upper Peninsula.
Yeah.
That's my retirement plan.
Yeah, go out on a laugh, I hope.
Yes. So there's a movie called Flock of Dodos, a documentary about the evolution debate.
Yes.
Have you seen it?
Yes, I have. One time, a long time ago, but yeah.
Okay. Well, this has to do with science communication. Mm-hmm. So the film
and a guy named Randy Olson, who became, he was a scientist turned filmmaker.
Yes.
And he's got some books about science communication out, and at least one documentary.
It's primarily focused on the evolution debate as it was playing out in Kansas a few years ago. But in one portion of it, he shows a social event, I think it might have been a poker game, of graduate students in evolutionary biology at Harvard playing poker and just talking amongst themselves, but for the filmmakers' benefit as well, about the state of science in our country. But the thing that is remarkable, and I don't know any of these gentlemen,
right,
and I'm not casting aspersions.
And I don't remember if I know any of them.
But the upshot of which was they were terrible communicators.
Compared to the anti-science people that
Right.
were represented.
And so there was a little bit where the flock of dodos metaphor in the film was that, like, if scientists don't become better communicators,
We'll be
they will
extinct.
be the dodos.
Yeah.
So that just brings us back around to the idea of science communication, especially in this age in which we currently live.
There's a growing awareness that science needs to be communicated better, and scientists need to communicate what they do better. It hasn't always been that way. And, I got to say that it's not wrong that some people feel, I don't want to communicate, I just want to do my research. However, you do need to raise money and all this, and we need the science explained, but not every scientist. I'm on board with the fact that not every scientist needs to be a brilliant communicator. Not every scientist can be.
Right.
But a lot of them are. And in fact, I know so many. And nowadays, it's really common. There's so many scientists that make great use of social media.
Right.
I have a friend that recently relocated to NC State. Katie Mack is very popular on Twitter. She's got over 250,000 followers. Okay. There are science communicators on YouTube that are popular video bloggers.
I'm a fan of Vsauce myself. Shout out, Michael at Vsauce.
Vsauce. I don't know him, but I
don't
know
him either,
Veritasium,
like
Derek
his.
Muller, and Minute Physics, Henry Reich, and Joe Hansen does It's Okay to Be Smart, which is a PBS web series. And they're all very, these are very successful science communicators.
Briefly, or as much as you like, I know you've done some work with Neil deGrasse Tyson, as he's known in popular culture. Tell us at least a little bit. What's it like? What kind of work have you done with Neil deGrasse Tyson? What's it like working with Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Yeah. So I first randomly got an email from him, and he had seen some YouTube videos of mine, and he reached out just to say he was very encouraging and just wanted to tell me that he thought I was funny.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, and then I was making science videos for Time Magazine, and when I made an astronomy one, I'd send it to him. I kept in touch with him as you would.
Indeed.
If you have Neil deGrasse Tyson's email address,
important advice to young artists and comedians: keep in touch with people.
Yeah. So this guy, I didn't abuse it, but I kept in touch, and then he invited me to do some pieces for his StarTalk radio show and podcast. And so though those shows were themed, he would send me a theme. We hadn't actually spoken at this point either. All we'd done was emailed. And hadn't met in person. But he would send me a theme. I'd write a short piece, record it, and email him the MP3. He'd do an intro and an outro and play the thing in the show. Eventually, I got to meet him and become friends with him. And here's one thing I have to say about him. He's very gracious. Like when we're out at a restaurant, he's always going to be approached by people. And he's very gracious about it. I've never seen him denied, even though we're eating or something. He's totally gracious about it. And then people will sometimes ask him questions. And I've seen him do this thing that I just chalk this down to being like the educator in him. Someone will ask him a question, and he doesn't just necessarily spoon feed the answer. He doesn't just give them the answer. He kind of makes them think about it. So I don't have an example, but I've seen someone ask him a question, and maybe it had an assumption in it, and he pointed that out. It's like he pointed out that there was kind of an assumption in that question, like maybe that's not a good question. And like so he sort of leads them. It's rather than just you've asked a question, here's your answer. He leads them to think it through to the answer in a cool way. So I just think that's a little bit about the teacher in him.
So for this podcast and the book I'm supposedly writing, the thesis is that what kind of effects did September 11th have on comedy? I have kind of a working hypothesis, if you will, that there's at least a subgenre of comedians who have intentionally taken on, whether it's religion in the form of religious satire or critical thinking skills in terms of being pro-science, as a reaction to September 11th. So just as a working comedian who was working at the time, do you have a reaction to that suggestion? Like, does it make sense, or would you dispute it, or?
I'm not sure.
Or do I?
Why would the critical thinking be a reaction to that? What are you saying?
As a way to combat certain type of
extreme radical religious extremist thinking.
Yes. So you said it better than I. Note to self: write that down when you get home. Put it in book.
Okay. I don't know, but I can tell you what my experience was with it, because there was certainly this thing when it happened.
Yes. Did it affect
there
comedy?
was this strong, the whole world. I think there were stories going around. Can America laugh?
Yes.
Can we be funny? Like right now,
Yes.
in the midst of this. Is it allowable for someone to have a positive moment or a smile or even laugh at something?
Yes.
I mean, certainly it was scary. It was terrifying. Terrorism was effect achieved, achievement unlocked.
Yes.
People were terrified and horrified and saddened. It was a tragedy. And, shows like, TV shows didn't suspended, Letterman. I don't know how, but then there was a thing. It's like, we have to come back from this. This isn't going to be the new norm. No, we are coming back. Now, for comedians, there was this weird backlash of like, oh, you're a comedian and you're going to get on stage and talk about this?
Sure.
But, some comedians, not all comedians, but some comedians are social commentators. And it's like, how can you tell a political comedian or a social commentator not to talk about the biggest thing happening in the world right at that moment?
Yes.
Certainly in the United States. How do you tell an American comedian not to talk about that? And weirdly, everyone else could talk about it. The news could talk about it. There's something, and this goes to other topics as well, where sociologists can talk about this, but a comedian, there's this thing where it's like, oh, because you're going to make fun of it, you're going to mock it. There's this idea that comedy is a defense mechanism, and certainly it can be.
Yes.
Certainly some comedy distances you from things. Instead of embracing it fully, you make cheap jokes, and it gets in the way of really embracing a topic. So that exists. But you know what also exists?
Right.
In the form of Bill Hicks and many other comedians, is comedy that's actually offensive, not offensive like I'm offended, but it's on the offense.
Right.
It attacks a subject and goes to the heart of it. It's not pulling this shield up. It is embracing the topic on the deepest level, going to the core of it. And it's simultaneously funny, but also hits you, like reveals something. And I think that you don't hear that talked about as much. Comedy can really... There's a famous quotation about, I think it could be somebody like Oscar Wilde, that it's like, if you're going to tell someone the truth, make them laugh, or else they'll kill you.
Right.
and there's it's been recognized, but I just think that's... Sure, there were offensive and racist jokes and cheap jokes about the terrorists or about people from that part of the world. Yes. Sure, there were bad comics and making cheap jokes that were offensive. But there were also people like Bill Maher and would have been like the people that we sometimes think, if Bill Hicks was only here for this, what would he have had to say about it? And it wouldn't have been cheap. It would have been interesting.
Yes.
And so... My dad was like, couldn't believe that I was going to go on stage and talk about this. And it's like, well, what do you think I'm going to talk about?
Right.
So I wasn't really a political comedian.
Okay.
And only a sometimes social commentator.
Okay.
But I think that I wrote what at the time I thought was some of my favorite stuff because it was very real. And you know what? I had two main topics that I wrote material on. And one was the media coverage. Which I found offensive because it turned this tragedy into good television. The coverage would have a theme song. There was a theme song on CNN, and there were titles, and I forget now, like America Attack, then America Rises, and America Strikes Back. It was this evolving program with... I found that very disturbing.
And it has never recovered.
Yeah.
I think the 24-hour news cycle now, whether Fox or MSNBC, just the format... has in the shadow of that event.
Yeah, I'd love to see before and after, what it really was. But so I thought I liked what I had to say, and I thought that was a pretty valid target.
Yes.
I didn't talk bad about the troops. I didn't talk bad about the terrorists exactly.
Right.
Okay, so I was disturbed, bothered by the media coverage, and I wrote some material that I really still look back fondly with. I don't remember it that well right now. The other thing is that all tied up with my 9/11 experience is the fact that on August 24th, just a couple weeks before, my mom had a stroke.
Okay.
So I came from San Francisco to Houston, and I was in Houston on September 11th when it hit. Then, I don't know how long the flights were suspended after 9/11.
Sure.
But it's like I had to get back to San Francisco already. I'd been there since the 24th or 25th of August. And so as soon as the flights resumed, I flew.
Okay.
And flying for the first time when airplanes had been involved in this, it was a very nerve-wracking experience. So I had a long story that involved all these parts of my experience traveling right after and looking at dark-complected people a little different. But I wasn't mocking them. In my material, I had these fears that I voiced and suspicions, but in the material, I turn out to be wrong, and I'm the butt of the jokes. It's really exploring these fears, and I don't think there's anything racist in it. Someone could argue that, but I think what it was, look, here was my experience flying, and I was scared, and I was wrong to be scared of that guy. And here's another guy on the phone speaking Spanish. I'm not worried about him because he speaks Spanish. Like they couldn't learn Spanish. Like just foolishness. So I'm like kind of mocking my logic at the time, my own irrational thinking.
Sure.
Despite that, get on stage, even though I feel that this material is inoffensive. There were some people that they don't even want to hear it. You go anywhere near the subject. I have an old friend who is kind of religious, and he would mention Jesus in his act, and people immediately get guarded and offended, and they're not hearing him out. He's religious. His joke, he's not making fun.
Right.
He's on their side, but they hear the word Jesus coming out of a comedian's mouth, and they're like, whoa, what do you...
Right.
But it's like, hear him out.
Right.
He's a Christian. Okay. He's a Christian. Let him say the word Jesus and just think, yes, he's a comedian. So I did find that it's like, no matter what, that there were audiences that are like, they didn't know, this is inappropriate. That I didn't come to maybe they came to a comedy club for escape.
Sure.
And they don't even want to be reminded of this.
Sure.
That's a part that you could maybe sympathize with.
Do you have any sense, including feel free to disagree, as to whether or not there is...
I totally disagree.
You're probably right. Good night, ladies and gentlemen.
I can't get behind this at all.
That there might...
I've lost respect for you.
Yeah. Well, join the rest of humanity. You were the last...
But the surprise is that I had respect for
you were the last holdout. Is there, perhaps, just an increase in the amount of religious satire since September 11th?
I don't know. If there is... is it because of that?
Correct. Yeah,
or is it just a natural trend? There always has been, all the way back to Lenny Bruce.
Right.
And probably 1,000 years before that.
Oh, well,
but
the ancient Greeks did religious satire.
Yeah.
So Shakespeare did religious satire. It's a standard type of comedy.
There's a quotation I love. I saw this in a book, and it astounded me. It has the word master in it. It's someone speaking to his teacher, master.
Yes.
Shall I crack any of those old jokes, master, at which the audience never fails to laugh? Aristophanes, 405 BC.
Right.
That just astounds me, because he's asking, should I go for the easy jokes? And they're the same jokes. They're the dick jokes, and they're fart jokes, and they're bodily. They are the simple, easy jokes that 2,400 years ago were already old and easy, hacky jokes.
Yeah.
And you'd like to think that we are so different from people in the 50s, the 1950s.
Yeah.
But here is an indication that 2,000 years ago, people were just like us. The internal landscape was surprisingly similar.
Right. Well, there's definitely, and again, it might be like data points of one.
Yeah.
But there are definitely specific comedians who became more bulldogish on religious satire.
Like Bill Maher?
Bill Maher is probably the prime example.
Yeah.
There are
He
others.
lost a show over a joke about the terrorists that was ridiculous. That he stated a fact. He said, was that people were calling terrorists cowards. Mm-hmm. And all he said is he was saying that he had nothing positive to say about them.
No.
He's just saying, you can say all these negative things about him, but they flew a plane, it's like, coward. It's just, that's beside the point. Coward isn't the right word. All these other insults, evil. It's like, he wasn't arguing that they were bad. He's just like, but don't call them cowards.
And if I remember correctly, Bush had said something similar.
Oh, that
they were not cowards.
How funny.
Because they flew, and Bush didn't lose his job. No. That's hardly fair.
Yeah.
The comedian's held to a higher standard than the president is.
So Bill Maher?
Well, a couple of other examples, prominent examples, would be Eddie Izzard. Mm-hmm. Eddie Izzard was on stage in 2005, 2006, doing jokes about science, which he does.
Yep,
jokes
and
about,
history.
In interviews since. And he said he was sort of agnostic-ish, and then on stage he decided he was an atheist. It just hit him, his own jokes convinced him. And then Ricky Gervais, probably.
Uh-huh.
Ricky Gervais is almost a new atheist, like some people would describe Dawkins and Hitchens.
Yeah.
Gervais in that camp. So there's definitely some specific comedians who, post-September 11th, felt like it was important to take religion down a notch, attacking hypocrites or promoting rational thought. So there's definitely at least a little something there.
Yeah, it's
the question
there.
is how much of a something.
Yeah, and I just don't have anything to add to, like, any kind of observation about trends. But that certainly existed, but it also existed before. Right. I don't know. I don't even know how we would measure it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way to frame it would be to say, post-September 11th, people who intentionally in that
switched gears and rose up to this topic.
Yeah, I mean, Louis Black did the first Comedy Central Presents half-hour special after September 11th. And if you want to talk about somebody who went on the offensive in a way that Louis Black can do, it's a very interesting example. Like, he had to address the topic almost.
Didn't one of George Carlin's HBO specials was recorded right in the wake of 9/11, and maybe it's in New York, maybe it's jamming in New York. I'm not sure what year. I don't know. But
I've
one of his specials,
that one. I can't remember the title of it, but that
that it was shortly after.
They had to remove some material, and he had to address it. The event.
Yeah.
It might be my single least favorite George Carlin routine.
Yeah.
And the reason is... Well, when I say that, I'm referring to not the whole special.
Yeah.
But at the very beginning, he addressed that September 11th had very recently occurred.
Okay.
And that material hit me with a wooden stick for even trying to judge George Carlin's material.
Right.
I'm not qualified to.
Do you remember what's the gist of it?
Yes, I do remember what the gist of it is. I think that, first off, the problem is that he didn't have time to work on it. Like, he was known to work for months and years developing material.
Yeah, his stuff was very
This had just happened, and something had to be said. He says, everyone who was alive at the time will remember, there was a window where Giuliani was a hero. And he actually does this whole little, pro-Giuliani rant. Put Giuliani in charge and we'll solve all these problems.
I mean, we felt that compared to Bush. We were that was a common perception.
And so there may be a degree to which it's dated.
Yeah.
Like maybe when he said it, it was like a home run.
Yeah.
But in 2019, you hear him say, no, that doesn't seem like the right answer.
What happened to that guy?
Yeah. Is there anyone who you think right now does satire well? Like any comedians or writers that you appreciate for their commentary or satire? I think probably Stephen Colbert is probably...
Oh, Colbert and John Oliver.
Sure.
Which we're not talking... John Oliver was a stand-up comic. Colbert...
was not.
I don't know what he was, but both of them are hilarious. And I mean, of course they have writers on their show and all, but they are both very funny on very serious topics. Right. Yeah.
Colbert has pretty much, since Trump's election, made every single opening monologue about.
And Jim Jeffries...
Jim Jeffries will be included in my book.
Yeah. Mark Maron's very funny and is probably often, has addressed serious social topics and sort of psychology, internal, personal psychology, sort of.
As the science communicator, I just want to ask you one more question. And actually, Mark Maron's a good segue.
Mark Maron has been reduced to a Segway.
Correct.
And we mean the scooter.
Yes. On his album, This Has to Be Funny, he has a routine about visiting the Creation Museum.
Okay. Oh, I haven't heard that.
Oh, well, first of all, stop listening to this podcast and go home and listen to that. I think it's on YouTube, but you should buy his album and listen to it properly. There's actually a whole cross-section of comedians before and after September 11th who have done bits about creationists.
Mm-hmm. Christopher Hitchens, not a comedian, but, there's a lot of stuff you can see on YouTube that are these debates about, in England, about whether the church has been a force for good or not, and him and Stephen Fry versus some vicars and things, and, Stephen Fry is brilliant, and Hitchens was vicious and amazing. I don't think he could be beaten in a debate.
No, and you can also...
And funny, but vicious.
All right, Brian, we are...
And Sam Harris. But wait, what was your point about...
I was going to see about whether or not you had any comments about using comedy to deconstruct creationism.
I did have one little line that I used to like about, not only do I not think creationism should be taught in schools, I don't even think it should be taught in church. It's like, you can, I realized at a certain point that I don't care if someone believes in God, really, but if they're young earth creationists, that's problematic to me, because, that rejects too much science. There are religious scientists who... They maybe believe in a higher power, believe in a God. They might be Christian. The guy that's the head of, Francis Collins is the head of the National Institutes of Health. Yes. And prominently a Christian scientist, and I have a friend that's a director of the Vatican Observatory,
right.
Brother Guy Consolmagno. I don't care if someone just believes in God, but they accept the fact that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and the universe is almost 14 billion years old.
Right.
But if you're a young Earth creationist, you are so clearly denying so much science that that's absurd and that's unacceptable.
Yep.
So that's a line that's too far. But I'm not as adamant as Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins.
Do you do
about,
this thing about evolution or creationism in your own act?
Not quite as aggressively and that's the thing. My sense of humor isn't as aggressive as that. Like, I would say that I don't attack sacred cows like that so much. I'm, I somehow celebrate science and silliness, and I find I love wordplay, but that's not. You learned early on that you can only do so much of that on stage.
Right.
But I have a kind of silliness, and I think that I might bring some interesting topics that you don't hear discussed, and I'd like to think that I'm doing something that you haven't heard exactly. Right. I'm not attacking the church. Maybe I'm not a satirist like that, I guess.
Well, Brian...
Is that a sad note to end on?
The non-satirist. We'll end our conversation. We have some events to attend, and then afterwards we'll find some sacred cows we can attack together.
Sounds like a
deal. All right. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Well, this is Jerry back. That was Brian Malow. What do you think? We know how to pronounce his name now, right? That's a thing. That's something we could bond over. I get my name mispronounced all the time. Hey, I really enjoyed that. If you're a geek, he'll make you laugh. That should be on a shirt if it's not already. Rational comedy for an irrational planet. I like it. I enjoyed his stories. I enjoyed his take on, we talked about religion a little bit, and just generally, religion is not a factor for him. He's more just talking about science. He just loves science, and I can relate to that. We can relate to that here at the Comical Heathen. Hey, let me know what you think. We have an email. We have all the platforms we're on, like iTunes and Stitchers. You can rate us. You can leave comments. Please let us know what you think. Hey, if you ever see a really fun or outrageous newspaper, magazine, website, article about some religious theme you think it might be fun to rant about, forward that to me. And if you have any guests, comedians, writers that do satire, religious satire, I love recommendations. And so rate us on Stitcher, rate us on iTunes, send us messages. And also, let me just throw out a couple of last thank yous. Thank you, Brian, for coming and doing this interview, coming to campus. I want to thank my friend Jeff Geddert. He advises me on the sound engineering and recording and mixing. Also helps me with the writing, contributing some writing notes and some jokes and things like that. So thank you, Jeff. Oh, that wonderful organ music you hear, that's my friend Mark Bell. And also, he is playing a Skinner organ, which is found on the campus of Lake Erie College. So I'll throw in another Lake Erie College shout-out since that's the theme of today's episode. Great job, Mark. You can get his CD of organ music. We love Mark. And also, hey, you guys, thank you. You've made it all the way to the end. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please share, please recommend, please give me feedback. And thank you for listening.